Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking an extensive look into the compelling and intricate legal proceedings of the Sean Diddy Combs federal case.
Yeah, it's a case that's captured a lot of attention.
Absolutely. Our mission is to unpack the prosecution's closing arguments, understand the defense's strategic responses, and explore the critical jury instructions that will guide the verdict.
Those instructions are key.
This deep dive is designed to give you, our listener, a clear, comprehensive understanding of the high stakes involved and the detailed arguments presented by both sides as the trial reaches its climax.
It's a lot to get through.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Before we go any further, just a brief but important note. This is a federal trial still in progress. All individuals mentioned are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law.
Right. That's crucial to remember.
The content includes discussion of sensitive topics. For the sake of platform safety and compliance, certain words have been replaced with appropriate alternative. Viewer discretion is advised.
So we've arrived at a really critical juncture in this trial, reaching day 29.
Day 29 already. Wow.
Yeah, the courtroom has been an intensely emotional stage filled with explicit evidence and, really high-stakes legal arguments.
Absolutely. We've seen some disturbing messages, video evidence presented by the prosecution. It's been quite heavy.
It really has. But then came the moment everyone was waiting for. Both the defense and the prosecution officially resting their cases.
That's right. That moment where everything shifts towards the final arguments.
It truly felt like the air was thick with anticipation in that courtroom.
Well, what's fascinating here is how aggressively the defense fought back, attempting to counter those claims of coercion.
How so? What was their approach?
So on day 28, the defendant's attorneys introduced messages they say indicated Cassie participated voluntarily in freak-offs.
Okay.
Even initiating them, apparently, and requesting intimate content.
Trying to paint a different picture.
Exactly. Now, while some messages were indeed admitted, others faced sustained objections, showing, a careful balance by the judge.
Right, not everything got in.
No. And Homeland Security agent Cerciello's testimony on text threads and travel records, alongside those sealed videos, formed a crucial part of the prosecution's presentation.
That sounds like key evidence for the government.
It was. Yet the defense shrewdly used some of Jane's messages to argue enthusiasm on her part.
Trying to undermine the coercion narrative again.
Precisely. Aiming directly to undermine those claims, it really highlights the complexity of evidence presentation,
Yeah, how the same piece of information can be spun different ways.
Exactly, by opposing sides.
Here's where it gets really interesting from a legal strategy standpoint, I think. The defense didn't just present their case. They made a significant legal move.
Oh, yeah.
Filing a Rule 29 motion.
The Rule 29, a standard but powerful move.
Right. For those unfamiliar with the intricacies of courtroom procedure, what exactly is a Rule 29 motion, and what was the defense truly hoping to achieve by asking the judge to just throw out the case?
Well, this raises an important question about legal strategy. A Rule 29 motion is a routine yet absolutely critical request.
Okay.
It's asking the judge to acquit the defendant because the prosecution, in the defense's view, hasn't presented enough evidence to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
So basically saying the government didn't meet its burden.
Exactly. It's essentially saying even if everything the prosecution presented is true, it doesn't meet the high legal bar for conviction.
And what were their specific arguments for that?
The defense argued specifically that there was no proof of a RICO conspiracy, no trafficking, no forced labor, and crucially, no criminal intent behind any alleged actions.
They hit all the major charges.
They did. They also claimed that key witnesses didn't initially report abuse, which they asserted weakened the government's entire case, questioning credibility based on timing.
Interesting angle.
And then, in a moment that carried significant formality and weight, the defendant himself stood before the judge.
He did. What happened?
He confirmed he would not be testifying in his own defense.
Wow. That's always a big moment.
It is. He even went so far as to thank the judge. After that, the defense officially rested their case.
And the prosecution?
The prosecution confirmed they would not present a rebuttal. No more witnesses from them.
So that was it for the evidence phase.
That was it. And this dismissal of the jury on day 28, telling them to return only for closing arguments, it really set the final stage for what was to come.
You can just imagine the tension.
Oh, absolutely. It's a moment of immense tension as the jury knows their deliberations are just around the corner.
Speaking of what was to come, a fascinating development surfaced with a letter from the government to Judge Arun Subramanian, dated June 24th, 2025.
Okay, what was this about?
This document was entirely about the jury instructions, the roadmap, if you will, that the jurors would follow to reach a verdict.
Ah, yes. Critically important.
So what does this all mean for the jury? Let's remember, they aren't legal experts. How do these instructions guide their monumental task?
This is a really crucial point. How do you ensure a jury comprised of ordinary citizens understands incredibly complex legal concepts like RICO or forced labor? It's a huge challenge.
Right.
The judge had actually asked both sides to streamline the jury instructions to simplify them for clarity and accessibility.
Make them easier to understand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the prosecution agreed to drop certain legal theories they no longer planned to pursue.
Okay, legal theories, what's the distinction there? They weren't dropping charges.
Right. It's important to understand this distinction.
Yeah,
They weren't dropping the actual charges listed in the indictment,
got it.
but rather clarifying the legal pathway to conviction. Think of it like this. If you're trying to prove a robbery, you can argue someone personally robbed the bank, drove the getaway car, or planned it.
Okay, different ways to be involved.
Precisely.
Hmm.
Now, if you realize there's no solid proof they drove the car, you drop that specific argument about the getaway driver.
Makes sense.
But the core case, that they robbed the bank, maybe planned it, still proceeds.
So this streamlining, it's not just procedural, it sounds strategic.
Oh, it's absolutely strategic. It's a sharpening of the prosecution's focus. By dropping maybe the weaker or more complicated theories, they're essentially telling the jury, look, we're confident in these core charges, and we don't want you getting bogged down or distracted by anything less direct.
Focusing the narrative.
Exactly. For you, the listener, it highlights how trials evolve and how prosecutors constantly refine their narrative to maximize impact before deliberations.
That's a powerful analogy for how these complex legal cases are built and refined. So what exactly were these legal theories that the prosecution opted to drop?
Okay, so on the dropped legal theories front, the prosecutors are no longer pursuing attempted kidnapping under California and New York law.
Attempted kidnapping, okay.
Also, attempted arson, remember the alleged plan to blow up Kid Cuties' car? That specific attempt theory is out for the jury instructions.
Right, the car incident.
And finally, aiding and abetting intercourse trafficking. That particular angle is also being removed from the instructions.
So those specific arguments are off the table for the jury's consideration.
Correct. However, and this is key, the main charges listed in the indictment absolutely still stand.
Which are?
Those are intercourse trafficking under direct liability, forced labor, the big RA co-conspiracy charge, and violent crimes in aid of racketeering.
So the core accusations remain.
Absolutely. The prosecution's strategy here seems to be narrowing the focus for the jury,
Yeah.
ensuring clarity on the theories they feel are strongest and most directly supported by the evidence presented over those 6 weeks.
It tells us they're trying to present a clean, clear path to conviction on the charges they believe they can most robustly prove.
That's likely the thinking, yes.
And beyond just dropping certain theories, the prosecution also sought necessary clarifications for the jury regarding some really nuanced and pivotal legal concepts. What were they pressing for?
Yeah, this was also really important. They pushed for several crucial clarifications to prevent any misapplication of the law by the jury. These largely fall into, I'd say, 3 main categories.
Okay, what's the first?
First, on redefining consent and coercion. This was huge.
How so?
They wanted to make it crystal clear to the jury that even if Jane or Cassie had initial consensual intercourse with the defendant, later acts could still absolutely be considered trafficking or forced labor.
So initial consent doesn't cover everything that follows.
Precisely. They gave the example that a love contract, even if someone willingly entered into it, doesn't negate later non-consensual acts.
That's a really important distinction.
It is. What becomes clear here is how the prosecution is meticulously dismantling the traditional, maybe overly simplistic view of consent. They're arguing that in situations with extreme power imbalances, true voluntary choice can be an illusion.
A critical insight for understanding these complex cases.
Definitely. They also clarified that payments like the $10,000 monthly rent Jane received or salaries paid to Mia or Capricorn Clark do not erase coercion or abuse under the law.
So money doesn't equal consent.
No. The jury, they argued, must look at the full pattern of behavior. This emphasizes that financial dependence can be a powerful tool of control, making any consent potentially given under duress not truly voluntary.
Okay, so that's consent and coercion. What was the second category?
The second was about the breadth of force and control.
I mean,
They wanted the judge to instruct the jury that physical restraint is not a requirement for trafficking or forced labor charges.
addressing the why didn't they just leave argument.
Exactly. This directly countered the defense's expected argument that Jane and Mia could have simply left. It suggests that psychological and emotional leverage, threats, financial control, these can be just as binding as physical chains.
Invisible chains, essentially.
That's a good way to put it. They emphasized that the pattern of behavior includes threats to Cassie, violence towards Jane, and abuse of others that the victims knew about, all fostering a pervasive culture of fear.
Creating an environment of coercion.
Yes. They also clarified that even if the defendant didn't directly receive money from Jane or Cassie's acts, he could still be guilty if he benefited in some way or trafficked them for someone else's benefit.
Broadening the scope of benefit.
And on intent or attempt for the trafficking charge, they asserted it's sufficient if the defendant intended or attempted to make the act happen.
Like the alleged incident with Cassie being dragged back to the room.
Exactly like that. Even if intercourse didn't actually occur after she was pulled back, the attempt to coerce her into it is enough for the charge, according to the prosecution's requested instruction.
So simply taking steps to coerce is enough.
Yeah.
Got it. And a third category.
The third was about clarifying legal definitions and the scope of the jury's task itself, making sure they understood the terms.
Like what?
Well, jurors, they argued, needed a clearer explanation of what reckless disregard means in relation to whether Jane and Cassie were being coerced. It's not a commonly understood legal term.
Right, translating legalese.
Precisely. They also sought more detailed conspiracy instructions on how conspiracy works specifically for racketeering and the illegal substance-related charges. The goal was likely to prevent prolonged deliberations or confusion on that complex point.
Streamlining the deliberation process, too.
Hopefully. They also wanted interstate commerce affirmed, basically stating that illegal substance trafficking automatically affects interstate commerce, which helps clarify a necessary element for the anaphore charge.
Okay.
On venue, they argued if the defendant contacted someone in New York to entice them, that's enough to establish venue in New York, even if the actual act happened elsewhere.
Connecting actions back to the district.
Yes. And finally, a really important one, unanimity clarification. Jurors don't have to agree on all the specific details of a single intercourse trafficking instance.
How does that work?
They just have to unanimously agree that one specific instance occurred. For example, if the jury agrees Jane was trafficked on a particular night, they don't all need to agree on how exactly she was trafficked that night, the specific method of coercion, maybe just that it did happen.
That lowers the bar for agreement on specifics, focusing on the act itself.
It does. It prevents a hung jury just because they disagree on minor details of an event they all agree occurred. This whole complex set of instructions is absolutely vital for the jury to navigate this nuanced legal landscape and fully understand the prosecution's theory of the case.
It really underscores how much rests on the judge getting these instructions right and the jury understanding them.
Immensely so.
Okay, so moving on. Day 29 marked the beginning of these highly anticipated closing arguments, with the prosecution taking center stage first.
The final pitch to the jury.
Exactly. And the tension in the room must have been palpable. Before the jury even entered, the defendant was reportedly seen thumbing through a briefcase, pouring himself water, appearing quite nervous, rubbing his palms together.
Understandable. His life at this moment truly is in their hands.
No question. The judge, in his instructions to the jury before arguments began, noted the stark difference in presentation time. 6 weeks for the prosecution versus about 30 minutes for the defense.
6 weeks versus 30 minutes, that's a massive difference.
It really is.
Yeah.
Then Prosecutor Slavic began, painting a very, very stark picture. Do you think the jury found that credible, this opening framing of the defendant, especially with such a time disparity hanging in the air?
That's a great question. Slavic immediately characterized the defendant as the leader of a criminal organization.
Strong words right out of the gate.
Very strong. Someone who doesn't take no for an answer and is into kidnapping, arson, forced labor, bribery of security officers, and the brutal crimes of intercourse trafficking. I mean, this is a very powerful, almost theatrical opening designed to shock and set a tone immediately.
Framing him as a crime boss, essentially.
Pretty much. She emphasized two key moments, March 2016 with Cassie at the Intercontinental Hotel and 2024 at Jane's house, calling them chapters in the same book.
Connecting the dots over time.
Yes. The core argument was that the defendant counted on silence and shame, believing his fame, wealth, and power put him above the law. This initial framing aims to establish the Araiko conspiracy early on, portraying him not just as an individual alleged to have committed crimes, but as the head of a systemic criminal enterprise.
And the time difference. How might that play?
Well, the sheer disparity in presentation time, 6 weeks versus 30 minutes, could psychologically frame the prosecution's case as far more substantial. Whether that's fair or not, it could influence how the jury perceives the weight of the evidence.
Creating a narrative of thoroughness versus brevity.
Exactly. It creates a narrative where the prosecution has meticulously built their case over a long period, while the defense's shorter presentation might be perceived by some jurors as lacking in substance, regardless of its actual merit or strategy. It's a subtle psychological factor.
Interesting. So Slavic didn't hold back, immediately launching into this concept of the Combs enterprise as a criminal organization. What did the prosecution need to show to establish this IACO framework, and who did they identify as the key players in this alleged kingdom? This seems like the foundational argument for everything else.
You're absolutely right. This is the foundation. The prosecution needed to show that this was indeed a criminal organization, described quite dramatically as his kingdom, where everyone was there primarily to serve him, including fulfilling his alleged intercourse desires.
And for RICO, what's the threshold?
To prove the RICO conspiracy, the prosecution only needed to show that at least 2 racketeering crimes were committed by members of this enterprise. Just 2.
Okay. And who are the alleged members?
They identified an inner circle comprising his chief of staff and bodyguards, specific names like KK, Christina Kororum, Drock, Bonds, Rubin, Uncle Polly, and Fahim were mentioned.
A whole cast of characters.
Indeed. The prosecution argued their roles remained consistent over time, often armed, acting to serve the defendant's will. They also highlighted financial aspects to show structure and resources.
Like the salary.
Yeah, like Brendan Paul making $100,000 annually, while KK apparently earned 6 times that. This underlines the hierarchical structure and the substantial resources available to the alleged enterprise.
Showing it was organized.
Right. The prosecution also argued that the enterprise impacted interstate commerce, even minimally, which is a key legal requirement for ARICO.
Okay, hitting that legal checkbox.
Yes. And then they gave an overview of the types of racketeering acts they alleged occurred within this enterprise. Illegal substance distribution, kidnapping, arson, bribery, facilitating intercourse trafficking of Cassie and Jane, forced labor, travel for commercial intercourse, and cover-up.
That's a wide range.
It is.
Ugh.
And jurors, they clarified, only needed to find 2 acts in any of these categories to satisfy the ARICO element.
So it gives them multiple paths to that conclusion.
Exactly. It makes the scope quite broad and flexible for the prosecution. It's a strategic way to cast a wide net and show a pattern of criminality, not just isolated incidents.
So after establishing this overarching enterprise, the prosecution then dove into the specific racketeering acts, starting with illegal substances. The argument was they were an essential ingredient of the freak-offs.
Yeah.
What kind of specific examples and evidence did they present to back that up?
They presented really extensive evidence on illegal substance distribution, trying to hammer home its role as an essential ingredient, as you said.
Right.
They identified D-Rock, KK, and Fahim as the most involved facilitators, but emphasized that others also ensured a consistent supply. It wasn't just 1 or 2 people.
A network for supply.
That's how they framed it. They detailed a wide range of hard illegal substances allegedly found or distributed, mentioning things like fulgiana, meth, oxyketamine, which they specified is a dissociative illegal substance, GHB, mushrooms, Molly, and even 2C, that pink combination substance. They pointed to specific exhibit numbers for these.
Showing the variety and availability.
Exactly. And they stressed that the quantities found weren't necessarily relevant to the distribution charge, and that distribution does not require a sale. This was clearly aimed at countering any potential personal use defense.
Then giving it away is still distribution.
Correct. As for examples, they cited Jane being told twice, allegedly, to bring illegal substances when flying to meet him, coordinating with KK. They even mentioned a reference to a Guido package, which they identified as ecstasy.
Specific instructions.
Yes. The security team's awareness was highlighted through text messages, like one supposedly showing Puff has a $450 balance with me, referring to the defendant, and another showing Brendan Paul asking for $780 for personal Gucci items, which the prosecution identified as code for hard illegal substances.
Using code words.
Allegedly. They claimed Cassie used illegal substances at every freak-off supplied by the defendant, and that the defendant introduced Jane to illegal substances, gave them to her at all but one hotel night, and also supplied other women like Carrie Morgan and Bannon Bangola.
Showing a pattern with multiple people.
Well, that was the goal. They brought up D-Rock texts like, need to see someone for bro, meaning the defendant and Guido asking Fahim to cover the defendant's illegal substance debt.
Suggesting ongoing transactions.
Right. They also claimed KK knew he was distributing illegal substances to women for these Wild King nights, and they even used Jane's bad come down, where KK allegedly offered her pro tips, as further evidence of this systemic distribution and knowledge within the circle.
Painting a picture of illegal substances being integral to the whole scene.
Exactly. An integral and controlled part of the alleged enterprise's operations.
Okay, from illegal substances, the prosecution then moved to kidnapping, alleging acts under both California and New York law, involving multiple individuals. That's a very serious charge. How do you think the jury found that credible, especially given the different contexts and timeframes? It sounds like they needed to show a pattern, not just isolated events.
Absolutely. And showing that pattern was precisely the prosecution's strategy. They aimed to demonstrate a consistent pattern of alleged control and unlawful restraint, making the various incidents, despite their differences in time or location, part of a larger, believable narrative of coercion.
So, connecting the dots for the jury, what incidents did they focus on?
They presented several distinct incidents. First, the alleged Cassie kidnapping. They described how Roger Bonds allegedly made her stay put.
Holding her somewhere.
That was the implication. And how the defendant, after allegedly calling Cassie a loose woman, supposedly stomped on her face, causing disfigurement. Then Bonds reportedly caught her trying to leave and brought her back to the defendant.
Wow.
She was then allegedly made to go to the London hotel on Sunset Boulevard to avoid being seen, even though she apparently wanted to go home to her mom.
Controlling her movements.
That's the claim. And David James testified the defendant demanded to see his phone search history to verify he hadn't posted online about the alleged assault, suggesting an effort to control information and intimidate.
Okay, that's the Cassie incident. What else?
Then there were two alleged incidents involving Capricorn Clark. The first was back in 2004 in Manhattan. She was allegedly held and made to take lie detector tests for days in an empty office building because some expensive jewelry was missing.
For days.
That's the testimony. Uncle Paulie allegedly took her to Bad Boy headquarters for 5 separate lie detector tests. And the test administrator supposedly threatened her, saying something like, if you failed, you'd end up in the East River.
A direct threat.
A very serious alleged threat. The defendant himself, they claim, told her he'd have to unalive her if anything related to the jewelry happened. David James also remembered being tested around that time to get the rat out of the team, corroborating the atmosphere.
And the second Capricorn Clark incident.
That was in December 2011, allegedly starting in New York and going to Kid Cudi's house. Rubin supposedly helped. The defendant reportedly banged on Capricorn's door with a pew pew, stating, get dressed, we're going to have to unalive Cuddy.
My goodness.
They then allegedly drove to Kid Cudi's house with the defendant holding a pew in his lap. And he supposedly wouldn't let Capricorn go until she brought him Cassie, who he then allegedly kicked into a fetal position when she arrived.
And Cassie testified to this.
Yes, Cassie, who was reportedly with Kid Cudi that morning, testified to this. And adding credibility, the responding officer to a 911 call made around that time saw a black Escalade registered to Bad Boy Entertainment near the location.
Connecting the vehicle.
Correct. By weaving these incidents together, Cassie's alleged restraint, Capricorn's interrogation, and the alleged armed trip involving both Capricorn and Cassie across different years and contexts, the prosecution aimed to show a consistent and systemic method of alleged control, intimidation, and unlawful restraint by the defendant and his associates.
Building that pattern brick by brick.
Precisely.
From kidnapping, the prosecution pivoted to arson, specifically the alleged setting on fire of Kid Cudi's car. This seems like a very direct and, frankly, dramatic accusation. What details did they provide to link the defendant to this specific act?
It was definitely dramatic. The arson claim focused squarely on Kid Cudi's car back on January 12, 2012. The prosecution described how someone apparently cut a hole in the car's roof and dropped a destructive device inside.
A Molotov cocktail, wasn't it?
That's what was suggested, yes. Now, they explicitly stated they weren't suggesting the defendant personally cut the hole or dropped the device.
Okay, so not direct action.
Right, but rather that he directed it. And they cited voice notes where he allegedly said he was going to blow up Kid Cootie's car. That's their evidence of intent.
The voice note is key there.
Very key. Then they emphasized a series of what they called coincidences to bolster the connection.
Such as
The defendant and Ruben being at Kid Cootie's house just a few weeks prior to the arson, and the fact that Kid Cootie was driving the same Porsche that got targeted.
proximity and timing.
Exactly. They also highlighted that Kid Cootie apparently had no known conflicts with anyone else except the defendant at that time, suggesting motive.
Isolating the defendant as the likely source of animosity.
That was the argument. Furthermore, they brought up that Drock later brought Kid Cootie to meet the defendant, and Kid Cootie described the defendant as looking like a Marvel supervillain during that meeting. And years later, the defendant apparently apologized to Kid Cootie.
An apology. For what?
The prosecution framed this apology as implicitly acknowledging involvement in the car incident. So the narrative connects the dots. Intent from the voice note, opportunity from the prior visit, motive from the conflict, and a post-event apology reinforcing involvement.
It's a very pointed accusation, as you said.
It is.
Right,
It's
right.
meant to demonstrate his alleged reach and willingness to use extreme measures, fitting into that larger pattern of alleged violent and coercive behavior within the RSEO framework.
Right. It adds another serious predicate act to the list. Now, the prosecution also detailed instances of alleged bribery, especially connected to that infamous Intercontinental Hotel video. This sounds like it directly ties into alleged attempts to cover up evidence. How did the defendant's team play their hand on this one, and what was the prosecution's overarching message?
The prosecution presented two main instances of alleged bribery. The first involved Jules Flores, the escort allegedly present during the Intercontinental incident in 2016.
Okay.
The defendant allegedly tried to hand Flores a stack of money right there in the hotel room, which the prosecution called his first attempt at a bribe that day.
An immediate reaction.
That's how they portrayed it. The second and much more detailed instance involved Eddie Garcia, who was an LAPD officer at the time.
The officer who responded.
Not who responded initially, but who allegedly got involved later. The narrative here was that after Cassie leaves the hotel following the alleged assault, the defendant began damage control.
Trying to manage the fallout.
Right. Calling Cassie over a dozen times, texting her, "Call me, cops are here," which the prosecution used to show his awareness of potential arrest because of the video footage.
He knew the video existed and was damning.
That was the argument. Carrie Morgan, another associate, reportedly had the business card of this LAPD officer, Eddie Garcia. KK allegedly suggested they tell police they just had a fun, drunk night, and then contacted Eddie Garcia.
It's reaching out to law enforcement.
Yes. Eddie initially said no, apparently, but KK showed up in person. Then Eddie, speaking off the record, allegedly told KK the situation looked bad on video.
Confirming the video was problematic.
So the prosecution claims. The defendant then allegedly called Eddie directly on his personal cell phone. And once Eddie supposedly relayed that his boss would retrieve the footage for $50,000, the defendant called Eddie "my angel" and saved him in his phone contacts as such.
My angel. Wow.
Eddie then allegedly delivered the USB drive containing the video footage with Drock and KK present. And the defendant supposedly counted out the $50,000 bribe dollar by dollar.
Direct cash payment.
That's the allegation. Crucially, Eddie reportedly asked the defendant, "What if Cassie calls the police?" The prosecution seized on this question to indicate the defendant's clear awareness that what he was doing, suppressing the video, was illegal and aimed at silencing a potential victim report.
Showing consciousness of guilt.
Exactly. They also mentioned Eddie finding the idea of a stand-in used for Jules Flores on hotel records, and that non-disclosure agreements were signed to prevent anyone involved from speaking.
Layer upon layer of alleged cover-up.
Right. And the prosecution argued forcefully that paying for silence wasn't just about avoiding bad publicity, as the defense might suggest. They framed it squarely as influencing potential testimony and obstructing justice.
So not PR, but obstruction.
That was their core message. This wasn't about managing a PR crisis. It was a concerted effort to obstruct justice and suppress critical evidence, tying directly into the RQ conspiracy through clear acts of cover-up and bribery.
Okay, now we come to one of the most significant and, frankly, distressing charges. Intercourse trafficking. specifically involving Cassie and Jane. The prosecution clarified this isn't about criminalizing dysfunctional relationships, as they put it, but rather forced intercourse with strangers. How do you think the defense played their hand in addressing these deeply personal and disturbing allegations? And what was the prosecution's central argument here?
This was undoubtedly the emotional core of the trial. The prosecution's central argument was that the defendant's inner circle assisted him, whether willingly or not, through a combination of threats, illegal substances, lies, and outright illegal violence to compel victims, specifically Cassie and Jane, to have intercourse with escorts against their will.
So it wasn't just about the defendant's actions, but the alleged system around him.
Exactly. It was about forcing victims, they argued, to have intercourse with strangers while the defendant watched or participated or endured being, as the prosecution put it, covered in oil and sore over and over again. They also stressed to the jury that legally, they only needed to prove the elements of trafficking were met one single time for a conviction, even though they presented evidence of many alleged instances.
Setting a low bar for conviction on that specific count, legally speaking.
Correct. Now, the defense, as we touched on earlier, attempted to counter this by arguing voluntary participation, focusing on messages suggesting enthusiasm or citing initial consensual acts within the relationships.
Trying to show it wasn't forced.
Right. However, the prosecution meticulously tried to dismantle this defense by showcasing what they argued was a pervasive pattern of coercion that evolved over time. They really hammered on the idea that choice can be an illusion under conditions of extreme power, imbalance, and control.
Let's break down how they presented that for each woman, starting with Jane.
Okay, for Jane's story, the prosecution described an initial love bombing stage. Jane was initially head over heels traveling to the Caribbean with him. Dr. Hughes, their expert witness, characterized this as a classic grooming tactic.
Laying the groundwork for exploitation.
That was the implication. This allegedly led to the initial exploitation, where the defendant supposedly gave Jane ecstasy, causing her to convulse. He liked specific things, like baby oil and red lights. In May 2021, she was allegedly high and wanted to please him. An escort came, and Jane was reportedly excited by the first experience. But as the prosecution argued, this opened Pandora's box, and these encounters became 90% of their relationship.
So an initial positive experience twisted into something else.
That's the narrative. The core of the prosecution's argument then shifted to the alleged ignored discomfort and forced compliance. Jane apparently wanted to do things outside these rooms, to travel normally, but her discomfort was ignored. The hotel nights were solely about his desires, they argued.
Her feelings didn't matter.
Allegedly not. He supposedly made her ask for nude photos, which weren't for her benefit. Was unhappy when she asked for protection during intercourse, was dismissive and condescending, and ordered her to slow down during acts when she tried to make them finish faster.
Undermining her agency completely.
That's what they aimed to show. The prosecution then emphasized the strategic use of leverage and threats. He allegedly dangled carrots, gifts, money, promises like a yacht trip that never happened, but these carrots turned into sticks.
Using manipulation.
Yes. They presented Jane's own notes from her phone app where she wrote, "I don't want to have you use me to fulfill your freaky wild desires in hotel rooms." They claimed he used her rent payment as leverage, saying things like, "Look at the roof over your head and your pretty mouth and teeth."
Financial control as coercion.
Absolutely. Jane wrote in her notes about threats and innuendos being nonstop. He paid for her veneers because he disliked her teeth, another form of control presented by the prosecution.
Changing her appearance to suit him.
Right. They played a voice note allegedly sent after she sent a picture during her menstruation, explaining why she couldn't attend an all-star party that involved intercourse with 3 men. His alleged response,
"I'm about to really disappear on you. You got me on my job. You got to get on your job."
the prosecution interpreted this starkly. He wouldn't take no for an answer.
Chilling interpretation.
It was presented as such. After Cassie's lawsuit became public, Jane reportedly read it and wrote to the defendant, "I feel like I'm reading my own intercourse drama. 2 of my birthdays, you forced me. You gaslit me. It was intercourse exploitation. You framed his love for your sick fetishes."
Her own words connecting her experience to Cassie's.
Yes. The prosecution then presented recorded calls where the defendant allegedly tried to trick Jane into saying everything was consensual, feeding her what they called a false narrative. Dr. Hughes, the expert, explained how victims often become trauma-bonded to abusers, which was central to understanding why Jane might have stayed or sounded compliant at times. Jane felt he didn't listen, just told her to move on.
explaining the complex victim psychology.
Crucial for the jury. He also allegedly threatened to show her intercourse tapes to her child's father to coerce her into more commercial intercourse acts.
Using deep personal threats.
Yes. Then came Miami 2024. Despite promising no hotel night, he allegedly called an escort anyway. Jane wrote around that time, "I hate worrying about the rent," again highlighting ongoing financial coercion late into the timeline.
Still dependent, still vulnerable.
That's the picture painted. And then the alleged June 2024 essay at Jean's house. This was presented as a particularly brazen act occurring just 3 months after Homeland Security searched his homes.
What allegedly happened?
After drinking and arguing, he allegedly pushed her head into a marble counter, shouted, "Kick down 3 doors." They showed photos of the damaged doors, dragged her by her hair back into the house, punched her in the face, photos shown of injuries, and then forced her to perform oral intercourse on an escort he had called.
A violent assault.
That's how it was described. And then, incredibly, he brazenly asked her, "Is this coercion?" while putting his face inches from hers. He then allegedly made Jane pay the escort, Anton, the next day.
Adding insult to injury, making her pay?
The prosecution used that detail effectively. They also described an NYC weekend in 2023 where he allegedly made Jane feel they'd have a proper weekend together, but then invited escorts. Jane texted someone, "It's dark and sleazy in fear of losing my home." His alleged response to her concerns, "Girl, stop!" He then reportedly FaceTimed her about shopping and dinner plans, but lied, setting up a hotel night while she was literally in the air flying to meet him, completing an act of intercourse trafficking before she even landed.
Deception and control at every turn.
That was the narrative. Even at a sobriety party without illegal substances involved, John was allegedly so disgusted by what was expected that she vomited afterwards, writing, "I'm not a PORN star, I'm not an animal, I need a break."
Her own words showing her distress.
Exactly. And finally, tying back to illegal substances and coercion, in Miami 2024, he allegedly gave her liquid Molly. They showed a video where the defense might argue she looked super into it, but the prosecution countered she was super high and thus unable to truly consent.
So that's the prosecution's case regarding Jane. What about Cassie? Hers spanned a much longer time.
Yes, Cassie's story was presented as long-term abuse, spanning decades, starting when Cassie was just 19 and he was in his late 30s.
A significant age and power difference from the start.
Absolutely. He signed her to a record deal, took her on a yacht, allegedly gave her ecstasy early on, and they began a relationship. By the time she was 21, he was not only her partner, but also her boss, controlling virtually everything in her life.
Blurring all the lines.
Completely. This led to pervasive control and dependence. He allegedly molded her, ordered her around constantly. They cited an example of him saying walk and turn around total compliance and fundamentally didn't take no for an answer. The abuse was described as multifaceted, physical, emotional, psychological, and intercourse related.
Total domination.
That was the prosecution's portrayal. Examples of control included demanding specific nail styles for red carpets, shouting about her hair choice at a Vanity Fair party, and allegedly preventing her from making her own money from music, like turning down an offer for her to be in a music video with Common.
Isolating her financially, too.
Yes. He paid for her car, clothing, phones, vacations, making her entirely dependent on him. Then there were the severe threats to family. After learning she was spending time with Kid Cudi, he allegedly demanded $20,000 from her parents, threatening to release intercourse tapes of her if they didn't pay.
Extortion using intimate material.
That's what was alleged. And the prosecution contextualized this by showing his bank account had $3.2 million flowing in and out that same month, highlighting it wasn't about needing the money, but purely about control and punishment.
Chilling. And the physical abuse.
For physical abuse and hiding, she was allegedly punched, kicked, and dragged on multiple occasions. When the abuse left marks, when she was bad, as they put it, he would allegedly hide her away in hotels to heal so no one would see. Drock, Rubin, Pauly, members of his staff, all allegedly knew about this. She was reportedly attacked just for attending a party hosted by Prince. Both Mia and Maya Morales testified to witnessing abuse against Cassie.
Others saw it happen.
Yes. And then the centerpiece, the Intercontinental Hotel essay on March 5th, 2016. This was the incident caught on the now infamous hallway video.
The video everyone has seen.
Right. After her movie premieres that night, she had apparently agreed to participate in a freak-off, telling him it was for damage control, texting something like, "I don't want you thinking I don't want to." An argument ensued in the hotel room, and he allegedly hit her in the face. She tried to leave without shoes. He allegedly caught her in the hallway, threw her to the ground, kicked her repeatedly, and then dragged her back towards the room where the escort, Jules, was waiting.
All captured on camera.
The hallway part, yes. He took her bag, went back to the room, then returned for her, grabbing her phone. He stayed in the hallway despite being only in a towel. When hotel security, Flores, arrived, he stalled, allegedly knowing Jules was likely naked inside the room. He then offered Flores money, the first alleged bribe attempt. The prosecution framed this violence explicitly as an attempt to get Cassie to continue with the freak-off she was trying to escape.
Connecting the violence directly to forcing the intercourse act.
Exactly. She later wrote in a message shown to the jury, "I'm not a rag doll. I'm someone's child."
Heartbreaking.
Right.
Were there other specific freak-off incidents mentioned?
Yes, the New York freak-offs involving an escort named Daniel Phillip. In one alleged session between acts, the defendant supposedly threw a bottle, dragged Cassie, and slapped her when she used a computer in the room, yelling, "B, when I tell you to come here, you come here." Daniel Phillip reportedly couldn't perform intercourse after witnessing that. The prosecution used this to remind the jury that a completed act of intercourse is not required for an intercourse trafficking charge.
The coercion itself is the crime.
Correct. At the Cannes Film Festival, he allegedly accused Cassie of stealing his illegal substances and threw her off a boat they were on without her passport. He also allegedly showed her freak-off videos involving other women and threatened again to release intercourse tapes of her. This, the prosecution argued, was clear-cut coercion.
Using humiliation and threats consistently.
That was the pattern they described. The lack of choice was a key theme woven throughout Cassie's testimony. She reportedly said she didn't know what no would turn into. He could be violent. The prosecution directly attacked the anticipated defense argument that Cassie made a choice every day to stay with him. They countered there was no true freedom to make voluntary adult choices, especially with illegal substances often serving as a buffer or coping mechanism.
Addressing the common question of why victims stay.
Yes, using the framework of coercion and trauma bonding. There was also the alleged essay incident after they met for dinner in Malibu years after their breakup. He allegedly raped her on the living room floor despite her saying no and crying. He later texted her, "I could tell I didn't turn you on yesterday." This apparent admission was presented alongside the concept of a trauma bond, explaining subsequent consensual intercourse they may have had.
Extremely disturbing allegations.
Very. Finally, they mentioned MMO alleged acts of masturbation and oral intercourse performed by the defendant, sometimes filmed, and urination allegations. This was described as sometimes an hours-long performance where he pleasured himself. Sometimes he allegedly told escorts to urinate on Cassie, or he urinated himself, supposedly to turn himself on. Videos shown allegedly focused on the escort, not Cassie, suggesting it was about his fantasy, not hers. And throughout this, Cassie allegedly became an illegal substance addict.
Just layer upon layer of alleged degradation and control.
That was the cumulative picture the prosecution painted for the jury regarding Cassie's experience.
It sounds like the prosecution really tried to redefine that common understanding of consent here, especially given the power dynamics and alleged long-term abuse. That's a huge shift for a jury to absorb.
It really is. It requires them to look beyond simple yes or no moments and consider the entire context of control, fear, and dependency.
And what about the alleged aiding and abetting intercourse trafficking? This charge implicates others in the defendant's inner circle. What was the prosecution's argument for their involvement? How did they tie them in?
Right. This charge broadened the scope beyond just the defendant. The prosecution argued that key members of his inner circle, specifically KK, Drock, and Fahim, knew what was happening was wrong and actively facilitated it, making them complicit.
So they weren't just bystanders.
No, the prosecution argued they were active participants in the machinery of the alleged trafficking. For KK, they claimed she facilitated access for strange men, as the prosecution put it, to hotel rooms for these encounters. They said she knew about videos of Cassie with an escort and even sent items needed for Wild King nights, despite Jane complaining about them.
Showing continued involvement despite knowing the nature of the events.
Yes. For Drock, they pointed to testimony that he iced Cassie's black eye after an alleged assault. The prosecution argued forcefully, it would be absurd to think that Drock didn't know what they were doing, implying he was fully aware of the violence and its source and helped conceal it.
Connecting him directly to the aftermath of violence.
Correct. And Fahim reportedly procured illegal substances and delivered them to the defendant even during freak-offs, sometimes between sessions with escorts. This showed his awareness of the context and his participation in supplying substances integral to these alleged events.
Fueling the situation, literally.
That's the implication. The overall argument was that even if these individuals weren't the ones directly committing the trafficking acts themselves, their actions made the alleged crimes possible. They enabled the defendant, making them legally complicit as aiders and abettors within the ICO enterprise.
It paints a picture of a broader network supporting the defendant's alleged actions, not just one person acting alone.
Exactly. That's crucial for the RICO conspiracy charge showing the enterprise in action.
Okay, moving beyond direct intercourse trafficking, the prosecution also brought forward charges of interstate travel for commercial intercourse. What's the nuance here compared to trafficking, and how did the defendant's team play their hand on this one, especially since it doesn't necessarily require force or coercion?
This is a crucial distinction and likely a strategic charge for the prosecution because the legal threshold is different. The charge of interstate travel for commercial intercourse means the defendant allegedly paid women involved in adult activity or caused them to travel across state lines for that purpose, sometimes booking the travel himself or having his team do it.
Okay.
The key nuance, as you pointed out, is that these transportation counts do not require force, fraud, or coercion.
That's a big difference from trafficking.
Huge. Even if all parties involved consented to the travel and the subsequent activity, it's still a federal crime if there's knowing transportation across state lines with the intent for the individual to engage in adult activity.
So the defense focusing solely on consent wouldn't work for this charge.
Exactly. It removes that element from the equation for this specific charge and widens the scope of potential culpability significantly. It focuses purely on the act of facilitating travel for commercial intercourse purposes.
What examples did the prosecution use to support this?
They provided several examples. For the Cassie freak-offs, they noted that escorts travel was often booked by the defendant's travel agents. They named Clayton Howard, using the alias Dave, who allegedly traveled from New York to Miami and LA. They mentioned Jules Theodore, using the alias Isa GX1402, who was present at the London hotel incident in NYC after traveling there. The defendant allegedly paid for her car service and a $2,000 hotel bill. They even showed a text message exchange, "I will tip you for what?" followed by the alleged reply, "intercourse."
Pretty direct.
Very direct evidence presented there. They also mentioned an escort named Reggie flying from Las Vegas to LA for intercourse. And in Jane's case, evidence showed she sent $1,100 via Cash App to someone, and a corresponding hotel folio showed $4,000 in room damage and noted bodily fluids on the floor, which the prosecution presented as evidence of the commercial adult activity that occurred after travel.
Using financial records and hotel logs.
Yes. And again, KK's facilitation was highlighted. KK allegedly helped arrange travel for women attending Wild King Nights, citing a trip to Vegas as an example. Texts allegedly showed KK knew what was going on, referring to the wildest Wild King Nights in Vegas, helped another person named Cabra book travel, and asked the defendant for cash specifically for these purposes.
Showing her role in the logistics.
Precisely. Each instance of arranging or paying for such travel was presented as a separate racketeering act under the RICO statute. The prosecution claimed there were dozens of such instances, demonstrating a systematic pattern of using interstate commerce to facilitate commercial intercourse.
So a potentially easier charge to prove than trafficking, given the lack of a coercion requirement.
Legally speaking, yes, the elements are simpler. It focuses on the action of transportation and the intent behind it.
Okay. The prosecution then presented arguments for forced labor involving 4 women, Cassie, Jane, Mia, and Capricorn Clark. What did this entail beyond just the freak-offs? And how did the prosecution address that common defense argument that victims could have simply left? This seems like it challenges a very common misconception about what constitutes forced labor.
It absolutely does challenge that misconception, and the prosecution seemed determined to broaden the jury's understanding of forced labor beyond physical chains. For Cassie and Jane, the grueling intercourse services were central to the forced labor claim. These were described as sometimes lasting up to 4 days or even longer. Jane confirmed this duration in her testimony.
Days at a time.
Yes. Both women were allegedly on call to perform freak-offs for the defendant whenever and wherever he demanded. The defendant's coercion in this context was illustrated by alleged statements like, "Let's finish on a high note, let's push through, you're not tired, are you?" pushing them past their limits.
Psychological pressure to continue.
Exactly. Victims reportedly took weeks to recover physically and emotionally from these sessions, and KK, again, was implicated for continuing to set up the hotel rooms and flights needed for these demanding acts. The prosecution emphasized that their labor wasn't just the intercourse acts themselves, but the constant availability, the toll it took, and the lack of control over their own time and bodies.
Defining the intercourse itself as labor under coercive conditions.
Correct. But then they expanded beyond Cassie and Jane to include Mia. Her case was particularly impactful in demonstrating forced labor in a more traditional employment context, albeit interwoven with alleged SA.
How so? She worked for his company, right?
Yes, Mia worked for Combs at Revote. She testified to allegedly going 5 days without sleep during demanding work periods. But the prosecution argued her forced labor included intercourse services due to multiple alleged essays.
What did they allege happened?
They alleged he put his hands up her dress without consent, came into her bedroom on a work trip and penetrated her, and came into a closet while she was working and forced her to perform oral intercourse on him. There was also an instance mentioned in the bathroom of a private jet that she couldn't fully remember due to repeated traumatic events, but under cross-examination, the details became clear as a bell, according to the prosecution.
So, intercourse acts forced upon an employee.
That was the argument, that she performed labor and services, including intercourse services, under coercive conditions. There was also physical violence alleged against Mia. He supposedly threw her against a wall once and slammed a door on her arm another time.
Creating a climate of fear.
Yes, and she also witnessed violence against others, like at Prince's party and during a trip to Turks and Caicos, which added to this atmosphere of fear and control. The threats and control were pervasive. They cited an incident in South Africa where KK allegedly told Mia, if you don't call in the defendant in 10 minutes, you don't have a job. This highlighted the defendant's immense power and control over her livelihood. Mia testified she knew she couldn't say no to his demands.
Job security used as leverage.
Absolutely. The prosecution also argued that HR was a puppet. Mia knew her job ultimately was to protect the defendant. HR was essentially Combs, so she felt she couldn't go to the police or HR itself due to his power and influence. Threats, both explicit and implicit, left her feeling she had no options. That's the picture they painted. And the prosecution proactively countered the anticipated defense arguments she could have left, or pointing to messages where she told Dee she loved him. They emphasized that Mia pulled no punches in her testimony about the extreme high highs and low lows of working for him, implying the complexity of her situation and the psychological bonds that prevented true freedom to leave.
Again, challenging that simplistic "why didn't she leave"
narrative. Precisely. It drives home the idea that forced labor isn't always about being physically locked up. Psychological and economic coercion can be just as effective.
And Capricorn Clark, how did her situation fit the forced labor charge?
Finally, Capricorn Clark's forced labor allegations centered partly on an issue she had with overtime pay. She took the issue to the head of HR, Vaster Wilson, but again, HR was described as the defendant's puppet, offering no real recourse.
HR failing the employee.
That was the claim. More significantly, she was allegedly threatened by the defendant and Uncle Polly in Central Park during that lie detector test ordeal we discussed earlier, and also in relation to the Kid Cudi incident. She had a young son to provide for, and the defendant allegedly threatened to blacklist her in the industry if she caused problems.
Threatening her entire career and ability to provide for her child.
Exactly. A powerful form of coercion. This collection of accounts, Cassie and Jane's intercourse labor, Mia's mix of professional and intercourse labor under duress, and Capricorn's coerced compliance through threats, aimed to show the jury a consistent pattern of the defendant using his power, threats, and fostering dependency to force individuals into various forms of labor against their will.
A broad definition of forced labor encompassing different forms of coercion.
Yes, tailored to the specific circumstances of each alleged victim.
Okay, finally, the prosecution's closing arguments culminated with charges of witness tampering and obstruction of justice, essentially weaving the entire story together. This seems to be the capstone, suggesting a systemic effort to control the narrative and interfere with the investigation itself. What exactly did they present to support these claims, and how does this tie into the overall RA-CO strategy?
This was indeed the capstone, designed to show the jury that the alleged wrongdoing didn't stop with the initial crimes, but continued with active efforts to conceal them and manipulate the legal process. It powerfully reinforces the criminal enterprise aspect of the RA-CO charge.
How did they connect it to specific witnesses?
Well, for Jane's case, the prosecution argued that after Cassie filed her lawsuit, Jane suddenly posed a problem for the defendant. He allegedly called Jane multiple times, calls that were reportedly recorded on KK's phone, trying to convince her that her experiences were just some kinky expletive we both enjoyed.
Trying to rewrite history with her.
That's exactly how the prosecution framed it. He was reportedly worried the U.S. Attorney's Office would get access to 3 years' worth of his text messages with Jane. During one of these recorded calls, the prosecution pointed out the distinct sound of notes being taken with a Sharpie marker in the background.
A Sharpie? Why is that significant?
They presented it as evidence of a pre-planned effort, suggesting someone was scripting or documenting the conversation to get Jane to corroborate a specific false narrative he wanted her to tell investigators. It showed intent to manipulate her testimony.
That's a compelling detail. What about Mia?
In Mia's case, the defendant allegedly had Drock reach out to her after the investigation began, asking her to say something, which the prosecution interpreted as asking her to agree with a fabricated story or publicly support the defendant. Mia's hesitation or refusal, they argued, was based on her having personally witnessed the defendant bashing Cassie's head, an event Drock also allegedly saw.
So Drock was asking her to lie about something he also witnessed.
That was the implication drawn by the prosecution. As the federal investigation intensified, they allegedly kept reaching out to Mia, with Drock apparently calling her 5 times in a row at one point. This persistence was presented as clear witness tampering and obstruction, a direct effort to silence or influence a key potential witness.
Showing a pattern of interference.
Exactly. And the notorious Intercontinental video incident was brought back into this context, too. The alleged $50,000 bribe paid to the LAPD officer to obtain the surveillance footage was presented not only as bribery but also explicitly as obstruction of justice.
Preventing evidence from reaching authorities.
Correct. It showed an alleged attempt to destroy or conceal crucial evidence and influence a potential testimony related to that assault. Finally, tying it all geographically, the prosecution asserted that proving an act occurred within the Southern District of New York, which includes Manhattan and the Bronx, was sufficient for venue for the overall conspiracy.
Connecting the crimes to the court's jurisdiction.
Yes. They cited specific alleged freak-offs taking place in Manhattan hotels, relevant to Count 2, Jules the escort's travel to the London Hotel in Manhattan, relevant to Count 3, and Jane's various interactions and alleged trafficking experiences involving Manhattan, relevant to Count 4, as fulfilling this requirement.
So it was a comprehensive argument.
Extremely comprehensive. It sought to show the jury not just the commission of various serious crimes over many years, but a concerted, systemic effort by the defendant and his enterprise to evade accountability through manipulation, bribery, and intimidation. This obstruction element is a cornerstone of demonstrating a functioning, racketeer-influenced and corrupt organization.
So after 7 weeks of testimony and these powerful, often emotional closing arguments from the prosecution, their message to the jury was unequivocally clear. Hold him accountable, find him guilty on all counts.
No ambiguity in their closing statement.
None at all. The judge then dismissed the jurors with those strict instructions we hear about. Don't watch the news, don't read anything online, don't talk to anyone about the case, signaling the intensely important period of deliberation that lies ahead.
A period of isolation and intense focus for those 12 people.
Absolutely. This deep dive has truly revealed the incredible detail and the multi-layered arguments presented by the prosecution in this high-profile case. It's been a lot to process.
It really has. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this case, regardless of the eventual verdict, raises such important questions about the interplay of power, fame, wealth, and the legal system.
Definitely.
The prosecution's approach, particularly their sustained emphasis on defining coercion beyond just physical restraint and highlighting concepts like grooming and trauma bonds that offers a crucial lens through which society, and perhaps jurors, can understand complex relationships and the subtle, insidious mechanisms of control.
It really challenges a simplistic view of consent and agency, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, especially when these extreme power imbalances are present. It urges us and the jury to consider the often invisible chains that can bind victims just as strongly as physical ones.
We've reached a turning point in this case, and the next moves the defense closing, the final jury instructions, and ultimately the deliberation could define the outcome. What's your take? What stands out to you as the most critical piece of the prosecution's case as presented in their closing, or what aspect of the legal arguments do you find most provocative to consider further? Drop your thoughts and join us again here on The Deep Dive.